Hi, I'm Davy Ward Erickson,
And I'm Elena Salks.
and you are listening to Sex is Medicine, your number one resource for holistic sex education. Elena and I are bringing you over 27 years of combined expertise in the field of holistic sexual wellness to help you integrate your body, mind, spirit, and sex.
New episodes drop every Thursday morning, so make sure to like and subscribe on all your favorite listening platforms. And make sure you follow Holistic Sexology Institute on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube for your daily dose of Sex is Medicine. Now let's get started.
Hello and welcome. You are listening to Sex is Medicine, the sexual wellness podcast for sexual rebels and spiritual warriors, and your number one resource for holistic sex education. I am your host, Davy Ward Erickson.
And I'm Elena Salks.
And we are so honored and delighted to have you here with us once again. I want to take a moment and thank all of you who have been sending us your questions, your comments, your appreciations. We so deeply, deeply, deeply value your words of appreciation. They are seriously nourishment for our spirit. It's part of why we keep doing what we're doing. And we deeply appreciate your vulnerability when you send us your questions and ask us for our guidance and our insight and how to support you in better love, sex, connection, intimacy, and healing. So thank you for being here. If you haven't already done so, please like and subscribe on all your favorite listening platforms. And without further ado, I would love to introduce our very esteemed and amazing guests for today. With us today are Marlene Gerber Freed and Loretta J. Ross, who are legends in their own name, so to speak. And we are so honored to have them here. Marlene Freed is a professor emerita of philosophy at Hampshire College and co-founder of the National Network of Abortion Funds. I'm sure I said that wrong. And Loretta J. Ross is a MacArthur Fellow, Associate Professor of Women and Gender at Smith College, and co-founder of Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Health Collective. They are co-authors with Jael Silliman and Elena Gutierrez, apologize for pronouncing that incorrectly, of Undivided Rights, Women of Color Organized for Reproductive Justice. So thank you, thank you, thank you both for gracing us with your presence, for being here with us today. And we are here to talk about your new book, Abortion and Reproductive Justice, that came out in September. Is that correct? September of this year? Yes, wonderful.
Yeah.
And
Thank you so much for having us. It's a pleasure to be here.
yeah, thank you. Thank you. So in beginning to read your book, and I'm going to say that I'm beginning to read it because I want to also share that it is for me it's a beautiful book, and it's also very emotionally challenging to read because I see myself in the stories of many of those women. I was one of those women, low income, living in Detroit, in need of reproductive support, and finding myself at Planned Parenthood, which was my only resource because of my economic situation, and then enduring things like non-consensual pelvic exams and non-consensual cervical biopsies and being used as a test subject without my consent. So this story, this concept of reproductive justice is one that I live, that many of us as women and people of color live, particularly in the United States and particularly when we're lower income. So yes, so I was sharing with Elena earlier that this is a book that I feel like I need to titrate, right? I can dip into it and absorb some of it, but then I really need to sit and be present with all that it stirs within me. And so part of what I love about what I've read so far is the distinction between that you all make between abortion rights and reproductive justice. And so that's a nuance that I believe that not many of us take into consideration. So could you share a little bit more about that distinction between abortion rights and reproductive justice?
Well, as you know, for so long, the sum total of what most mainstream organizations that work in this area, understanding of reproduction was about abortion. It was like an abortion as a single issue, as if it is not related even to sex,
Yeah.
but do
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Not related to economics, not related to where you sit in your family and in the world. So that in some ways that's really a mistake. It's a mistake in so many counts. It's a
Mhm.
misunderstanding of how holistic
Yeah.
our lives are.
Yes.
Like, oh, how's your reproduction going? Well, I didn't have an abortion. Do you know what I mean? It's not,
Yes.
and also that it's a mistake in terms of all the different entry points into these issues. It's a mistake in politically in trying to think about who are your allies, who are the people who are in this fight with you. And so you have this construct of the so-called people who are for choice, but apparently not life, and the people who are for life but not choice. And that's just such a it's not a construct that really resonates with who anybody is.
Well,
So
to
for
me,
us, opening up reproductive justice opens it up. I mean, it opens up the understanding of the world. It opens up your experience. It opens in so many different ways.
yeah. So it's more of a holistic and inclusive concept as opposed to just abortion rights. And that I've often said like the whole thing about pro-choice or pro-life, like to me that's gaslighting. The whole concept of really, I mean, and I think
It
that's
is.
sad. Like the whole concept of pro-life has been to gaslight, to make it like an impossible choice, right? So I love that referencing reproductive justice just removes that argument of pro-choice or pro-life. Like it removes the need for duality.
And it also it centers different people. So when you take a justice lens, you're thinking about who are the people who are most not getting justice on any front, whose lives are structured by this, tapestry of oppression, of so many different oppressions, and you're also not appreciating the degree to which race and racial configurations and white supremacy has structured our entire country from the beginning. So it's not just today, it's not just these people who seem, completely out of control. This is, they're carrying on the tradition.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, and again, something that stood out for me because I remember this very viscerally is when you talk about in the book about how again abortion rights, like we may have the right to abortion, but that doesn't mean that we have access to abortion. And I remember very clearly when that law occurred that removed that Medicaid and Medicare government subsidies, should we say, or government payments that would go to abortion. I remember that argument happening and I don't remember how old I was, maybe middle school or high school when that was happening. But I remember that conversation and how even though you have the right to abortion without the resources, you don't actually have access to abortion. So your book teases that out and describes that very, very succinctly. So,
Well, you're just talking about the Hyde Amendment that
yes.
was named after Henry Hyde and was passed in 1976 and affirmed by the Supreme Court in 77.
Okay.
And basically, it represented a taxpayer revolt where taxpayers suddenly decided, following a whole lot of other taxpayer revolts that were based on white supremacy and race, saying, I don't want my money paying for those people, basically. And it started with first property tax revolts about not wanting to pay for the education of children of color. And
Mm,
then this perception that poor women are getting their abortions paid for by my tax dollars, and poor women is read as women of color.
mhm,
And so it really continues the whole white supremacist theme we wanted to emphasize in the book, that if you don't understand white supremacy, you don't understand reproductive politics, because it's never just about gender. It's
mhm,
about who has the right to produce and is encouraged, and who is actually inhibited from reproducing and discouraged. And even though it seems counterintuitive to say, well, if they don't want more Black children, why don't they support abortion rights? No, they don't even like seeing Black women as human beings who
Mhm,
have any human rights.
mhm, mhm,
And
mhm.
so that even trumps whether or not they would like us to have abortions. The whole question of us claiming our human rights is anathema to them.
100%. And so, like, the broader conversation of reproductive justice is really the awareness of white supremacy, because reproductive justice is, kind of in resistance to white supremacy. Is that accurate?
If you're not identifying white supremacy and neoliberal capitalism as a problem, it ain't reproductive justice.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. And that's why the justice piece is so important, because it's about who has access and who, not just legal access, but economic access and social access and, emotional access and, physical access. And so, Elena, what were some of the things that stood out for you in engaging in the book from your
Yeah.
perspective?
Yeah. I so some of the things that you named were really present for me as well. I too had kind of known the abortion issue in the pro-choice and pro-life argument realm. And so I had heard of reproductive justice, but I had yet to investigate it more deeply. And so I too resonated with the definition of reproductive justice as being the right to have or not have children and the right to be able to raise those children, right, healthfully and happily. And yeah, I also really deeply resonated with the stories that were presented there as well, so that I could get into the mindset and really understand some of the experiences that people have had in their lives, which really I found to be a beautiful way to present this content and a beautiful way to anchor um, myself and your readers in the truth of the lived experience of the people who are affected.
And it's also justice is a bridge. It's a bridge to other people, to
Mhm,
other movements, to other forms of oppression. And
mhm,
so often the choice life thing has been like burn the bridge. I'm not talking to you. I can't deal with you.
mhm,
So I think and insofar as it does that, it lets us listen to other people. I mean, like, whose story are you telling? Where does this story begin? It doesn't begin with Roe v. Wade. It
mhm,
doesn't even begin with the Hyde Amendment. It's a very long story, which hopefully will not go on in perpetuity, but it's at this moment in time doesn't it's not looking great. Mm.
mhm,
And we felt the need to tell the story and the history of reproductive politics through a different lens. Because so many times when you talk about reproductive politics in the United States, it's through the lens of what happened to white women,
Mhm.
which is a legitimate story, but it's only a partial story. Because at the same time, specific oppressions directed towards white women were occurring, there was a racialized and gendered oppression directed towards women of color, particularly with the reproductive disappearance of indigenous women
mhm,
because of the settler colonial project, and then the forced breeding of enslaved Black women because of racialized capitalism. And so, if you fail to tell those stories and the stories of immigrant women who are forbidden to come here, even though they needed the labor of immigrant men from China, for example, you have an incomplete history of reproductive politics in the United States and how it's so deeply intertwined with how capitalism developed in the United States and who benefited from that and who's consistently orchestrates policies in our society so that a certain part of the population benefits and everybody else suffers.
Mhm.
mhm,
And you don't even see everybody else. I mean, in more recent history, at the time that Roe v. Wade was being decided and the movement for abortion rights was quite robust, it was exactly at that time that women of color were ringing alarm bells about sterilization abuse. But that was not part of the Roe v. Wade story. And
Mhm.
it's just kind of, I mean, it's sort of breathtakingly clueless, or this is, something that you're like looking in such a narrow way that you can't see much of what's going on.
I mean, but that's the commitment of white supremacist society, right? It's like what isolated events and this very narrow view, and so to expand the view to include the whole history is the whole picture. And like it white supremacy functions to separate and to
Mhm.
compartmentalize and to narrow the lens and narrow the view to target just its own interests. Something that stirs in me about the concept of reproductive justice is not just about whether or not we want to give birth, but how we want to give birth. And so, what comes to
Mhm.
mind for me is the criminalization of midwifery that's
Yeah.
also been happening very actively. I would say I'm aware in the last 5 years, but probably for longer than that. But like laws that are actually criminalizing midwifery, which again, for many women of color, is a way more supportive, avenue for giving birth than in a clinical hospital and having to navigate medical apartheid. Right.
Mhm.
So that also plays a picture in reproductive justice, as you talk about in the book, is the concept of medical apartheid and how Black women are disproportionately negatively, Black and other women of color are disproportionately negatively affected by, particularly in birthing. Like Black maternal death is like, is huge. And so in order to save our lives, we want to be, we want to work with a midwife instead of in a conventional, avenue. And our ability to do that is being impeded and criminalized, quite frankly. So I love how the conversation of reproductive justice, again, it's not just this narrow focal point on abortion, it's the entire experience of reproductive health. And I'm wondering, does the concept of reproductive justice, is that inclusive for people who identify as men, not necessarily trans men, but cisgender men? Is that something that's woven into the concept of reproductive justice?
Well, of course, when we retell a history, we talked about the sexual abuse that occurred towards enslaved men, where
Mm,
they were forced into breeder, buck breaking, that you know, actual rape of men to force them to become more compliant with the breeding schemes and stuff like
mm,
that. What I am disappointed in, though, is since the 1980s, Black women have been demanding that Black men start a human rights based reproductive health justice movement for themselves.
mm,
And yet, the patriarchy still makes Black men relegate all responsibility for dealing with reproductive health matters to women, and
mhm,
they don't see their own stake in it until you frame it a particular way. I remember being in Mississippi organizing against a personhood amendment in 2011, I think it was. And they would have said that a fetus is a person from the moment of conception. And so they were trying to undermine abortion rights with that kind of amendment to the Mississippi Constitution. I
mm,
couldn't get men, and particularly Black men, to pay any attention till I said, would you like to start paying child support from the moment she's pregnant?
mhm,
And then they're like, excuse me, now you got my attention.
mhm, mhm.
And so I think there needs to be a men's health movement that speaks in a register that men can understand and to call them out for delegating and relegating responsibility for the continuation of our community only on the shoulders of women.
Yes, thank you.
But it is the pecking order of power in white supremacy. I mean, you hold on to what little power you have. So, for white men too, there's not been a men's health movement or a men's rights movement. I mean, the men's rights movement is usually anti-women. So it's not. When I think about it in terms of power, then I understand it. But
Mhm,
when I think about it in terms of the logic of where your self-interest is, where your future is going, it just doesn't make sense. Which I think is why, for me, in the end, I do think we're on the winning side of history because I think you can't fool people forever. You can't just make everyone sit there and watch Fox News their entire lives. It's just not, it breaks down as it is breaking down in this Epstein moment. You know, it can't,
Mhm.
it's just sometimes reality comes through.
Yes. Yes. Yay for Epstein, eh? I mean, not for him
Well,
specifically, but
it's
for
like
the,
pathetic, isn't it?
yeah,
I mean, it's like,
exactly. Yeah.
Well, we're actually rooting for the truth.
Yes,
exactly.
exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. That's what I mean. Yes. Not him specifically, but
Right.
the truth, the
Right.
exposure. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. The shadows coming to light.
Yeah.
Right? Yes. So in terms of, the reproductive justice movement, how does that intersect with other movements like the Black Lives Matter and the LGBTQ and, the social justice, right? Reproductive justice is social justice. So I would imagine it intersects with all social justice movements.
And it's been not exactly easy to
Yeah.
have other movements embrace
Mm.
reproductive rights because that's been the Achilles heel. I mean, even though it's not abortion only, abortion is a place where the white supremacists and the anti-abortion people and the right wing have poked. You know, they've saying, like, oh, we can divide people
Mm.
along this axis.
Mhm.
But having said that, there've been a fair amount of bridges built to
Mhm.
Black Lives Matter, to disability justice, to LGBTQ movements. So, several of the organizations have actually changed their names to embrace so now it's disability justice, not disability
Mm.
rights, because some of what the
Mhm.
reproductive justice movement has done is exposed how meager constitutional rights are as opposed to human rights.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yes.
if you look at our analysis that was gifted to us by Forward Together, formerly Asian Communities for Reproductive Justice, they're the ones that showed the three pillars of our movement. There's the reproductive health sector, the individual doctors and nurses and midwives and people who provide health services to individuals. Then there's the second pillar is the reproductive rights movement, also synonymous with the pro-choice movement,
Mhm.
who tend to fight for sexual rights within the confines of the US Constitution.
Mhm.
They're the ones like the Center for Reproductive Rights or NARAL or U.S. Planned Parenthood that's fighting within the U.S. Constitution and its limit, going to the courts and all of that. Reproductive justice is seen as the human rights organizing base.
Mhm.
Our job is to build bridges to all of those other movements because we use that intersectional analysis that allows us to do so. And I'll tell you a quick story about Black Lives Matter.
Mhm.
After I had left Sister Song, its current executive director, Monica Simpson, called a meeting of the Black women who were leading Black Lives Matter to meet at the Sister Song house because they had done their plan of action with no mention of reproductive politics. And so once Monica brought it to their attention that how can three or four Black women talk about Black Lives Matter and not talk about reproductive justice, the women to a person said, oh my God, I've been a personal feminist all my life, but I never knew until this moment what being a political feminist means. That I have to talk about the totality of my life,
Yes.
not just have police violence separated or pigeonholed over here and reproductive violence separated and pigeonholed another place. And I
Mhm.
thought that was the kind of insight that reproductive justice seeks to bring to environmental justice, disability justice, racial justice, et cetera, et cetera.
And that makes so much sense because I mean reproductive justice is like that's the core. I mean we come from mothers, and if our mothers are not cared for and well, like birth trauma is a thing, and that then has ripple effects throughout the rest of our lives. Like how we are born into this world affects our brain, it affects our nervous system, it affects every aspect of our being. And so if there's traumas that occur, those are going to replicate and reverberate throughout the rest of our lives. And again, as I was saying, the mother is the foundation, right? Our our reproductive, how we come into this world and how we procreate, is fundamental to our experience of ourselves as human beings. So, I mean, the fact that it's like those dots haven't connected is astounding. Go on.
But I also want to push a little bit further because one of the beauties of the reproductive justice framework and its intersectionality is that we look at both biological and non biological oppression.
Yes.
So while there may be medical apartheid as in how you're treated, there's going to be housing scarcity
Yes.
and
Yes.
feeling like facing evictions. It's also going to determine your birth outcomes, or
Yes.
whether there's violence from your partner is going to develop affected, or whether or not your child is going to duck guns on the way to school, gun violence on the way to school. It's going
Absolutely.
to affect all of those things. Arlene Geronimus calls it weathering.
Yes.
The
Yes.
impact
Yes.
of all of these concussive oppressions mean that our health is worse.
Yep.
We have shorter lifespans. We're more inclined to diabetes and heart disease and all of these.
Mhm.
And so all these non-biological things, the way they show up physiologically in our bodies, also has to be connected into what a real human being experiences.
I mean, even at
100%.
the pregnancy, where the pregnancy, how did it develop,
Yes.
right? Was it forced breeding? Was it rape? Was it so you can't isolate that. I think that's the lesson of intersectionality, which is a lived concept. I think it's important to say these concepts, reproductive justice, intersectionality, they didn't come from academia. They're
Mhm.
in academia now, but that's not what happened. They came from people's experiences of living and of organizing. And so it's not abstract. It was interesting as someone who's in the pro-choice, I was in the pro-choice movement for a long time, fighting from the edge, like it's not just abortion. And it was always like a big thing to try and explain that to people. For women of color, it was never a big thing. It's of course these things are all connected. And similarly for international, which in a way reproductive justice was inspired, or Loretta was inspired by the international context. And again, these societies where the histories of fighting colonialism, dictatorship was all connected to who could have children, who couldn't have children, how you had children, did you have children, are you prevented from having children? So I, I feel like I think that we have in this country done a disservice to all of us
Mhm.
in terms of developing our thinking and the breadth of our imagination. And in some ways, reproductive justice is trying to, give it back. Like, think big.
Mhm.
It seems hard in this moment when even the smallest thing you can't, get, but it's such a critical thing.
Can I also go beyond discussions of our book for something else that has captured our imaginations?
Mhm.
And that is the reproductive justice framework was written in the 20th century, 31 years ago. And there is an urgency to update it
Yeah.
for dealing with 21st and 22nd century challenges like
Mhm.
genomic technologies and the fact that some billionaires are playing with the entire human genome as they sculpt a techno future, what we call neo eugenics, for themselves that doesn't necessarily include us as fully human beings, because they're even talking about growing people of color just to harvest our organs and stuff, but not necessarily, again, reckoning us as fully rights bearing people.
Mhm.
As in the past, they want to continue that in the future. So
Mhm.
we need to criticize and really examine philosophies like effective altruism and long termism using the reproductive justice framework So we call that body of work reproductive justice futurisms, where
Mm,
we are not only looking at past practices and present practices, but projecting what is a Black feminist analysis of what we have to deal with as eugenics gets upgraded itself using new technologies, but old thinking
yeah.
around white supremacy and patriarchy.
Yeah, and that's what's horrifying to me with this whole like AI thing and all the, upcoming technological developments is where they're coming from. The lens through which they're being developed. It's horrifying to me. I mean, yeah, yeah. Um, are you a therapist, coach, or sex educator looking for somatically based sexual healing methods to support your clients? Are you looking to become a certified sexologist and seeking a training that offers both an academic and an embodied approach to learning? Welcome to the IHS Holistic Sexology Certification, an accredited trauma-informed certification in holistic sexuality, somatic healing, embodiment, and pleasure-centered care. Early registration is open now until December 31st. Save $2,000 on your tuition when you apply now. Visit us at holisticsexologyinstitute.com to learn more. Another a thread that weaves through all of this from our perspective. So we work heavily in trauma, in the understanding of how trauma affects the body, the brain, the nervous system, and how trauma is passed down intergenerationally, both through our biology, our physiology, but also relationally. And so that's a thread that's like strung as we're talking about reproductive justice and how it intersects with Black Lives Matter and LGBTQ and disability rights is really the conversation is in some ways a conversation about trauma and how these systems of oppression and lack of resources and lack of access are actually traumas. And then how, when I, as a mother, am traumatized, how that changes my DNA. Literally. And then how I pass that trauma down onto my children and their children and their children. And so their health outcomes are going to be, more detrimentally affected. Their, income, poverty, quality of life are all going to be negatively impacted by my experience as a mother and having to navigate systems of violence in order to access, maternal health care and reproductive health care. And so that's just something that stands out to me in this conversation is the understanding of being trauma informed seems like a very necessary aspect in the conversation of reproductive justice, if that makes sense.
And trauma in the service of
Yeah.
keeping it going, keeping the systems of oppression that cause the trauma
Yes.
going. So
Yes.
it's not accidental. I guess as you pull
Yes.
that thread, what you see is that somebody is pulling the string on the other side.
Yeah. Yeah, it's intentional. And again, like, you speak to in your book and we alluded to in this conversation here, it's by design. It's from the inception of the United States. The way the United States was established as a functioning entity is rooted in white supremacy. People don't like to hear that, but it's the truth. Like, and then how that system of white supremacy replicates itself throughout history, and then those who are adversely impacted, because it's easy to ignore it when you're not being detrimentally impacted, but when your life is is being legislated and we're not viewed as fully human, we don't have a choice but to engage with it actively.
And part of what we hope intended our book would do was give people tools to identify in each era, like the great replacement theory. What is that? That's old thinking in a new whatever.
Yeah.
So it's important to not to understand that these issues keep cropping up and they take new forms. And you're just like, oh, look, there it is again. But I think for us, being able to see that and to look back, but then also to look forward
Mhm.
and see, well, what's coming up on the horizon and trying to get out ahead of it.
What's the
Mm.
rebrand?
Exactly.
Right?
What is
How
the
they rebrand
rebrand?
it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you see a lot of it, like this whole trad wife thing. I mean, it's just, everything old is new again, everything new. It's just the same thing. Although, again, for one of the things that's very clear to me in this moment is how people really we don't know our own history. We don't know the
Mm.
history of this country. And if the forces of authoritarianism have their way, it's going to get worse,
Oh,
as we get rid of every book that talks about enslavement, that anything that talks about feminist and LGBTQ liberation. You just so fighting at every possible level, fighting at your local library so they don't take those books away is critical.
yeah. And I will say, something that arises for me is the overwhelm and the agony of the constant and unrelenting fight for humanity.
Yes, yeah,
Like we just shouldn't have to fight.
But
no, we
it's
shouldn't.
also our particular responsibility as Black women. There's
Yes.
something sacred about knowing that mitochondrial Eve was a Black woman. We birthed humanity.
Yeah.
And so it may be our particular destiny to be the saviors of it as well, because that might be something that we were gifted to as a responsibility.
Mhm.
I tend to see the entirety of humanity as our cousins.
Yeah. Yeah.
We got good cousins, we got bad cousins, we got light skinned cousins, we got white cousins, we got dark skinned cousins, we got stupid cousins, we got smart cousins. We family. And we're going to show up in all the different crazy ways families show up.
Mhm.
But those of us who are rooted
Mhm.
in that chain of freedom that knows it goes back from our ancestors or forward towards our descendants, we know we have a special privilege to see the chain and delight in the responsibility for making sure that chain doesn't break at our link.
But don't
Beautiful.
let the oppressors off the hook. I
Beautiful.
mean, as a white person in this,
Well, we also need to talk about the role of anti Semitism in all of this, too.
exactly.
That's totally mixed up in this and
Yeah,
does not get enough uh, written about it in
right.
reproductive politics as well.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about anti-Semitism in reproductive politics.
You want
And
me to
not
take
in the
it?
way that they're talking about anti-Semitism now. It's
Well, the part that I pay particular attention to under this great replacement theory BS that they're running, they are accusing Jewish doctors
right.
of leading white women into having abortions as an attack on the white race. But that goes back to their earlier theories that the black liberation struggle was being manipulated by Jews because black people don't have enough brains to successfully, launch a civil rights movement and overturn laws and get civil rights laws passed and stuff. And so that, of course, goes back even further to how in the Dark Ages in Europe, long before they discovered, quote, the New World, they built anti Black racism on a template of anti Semitism when they decided to change the European relationship to Africa from one of trade to plunder.
Mm.
And so
Mm.
for the Jews, what was a religion became a race. The
Mm.
same thing that happened to
Mm.
Muslims. What was a religion
Mhm.
became a race. And what
Mhm.
was a religion called Christianity became a race. The
Mhm.
earliest iterations of whiteness as divine and
Mhm.
everything else as barbaric.
And
And
why
then
this
thinking
matters.
about, I mean, I'm sorry, but and also then thinking about how Jews weren't considered white, like Irish. I mean, the whole idea of who's white is
Mm-hmm.
again in the purview of the powerful. They get to
Mm-hmm.
decide.
Mm-hmm.
So to resist those distinctions which are disempowering. They're only in the service of keeping most of us down. That's all
Mhm.
that this is serving.
And divide and conquer. And
Exactly.
what I love about presencing the history is A, we need to know it, and B, that is the history that lives in our DNA.
Lives in our DNA.
Yes. And so that's why it's important to presence it because it's operating within us, whether we're aware of it or not.
Yes.
Yeah. Another piece of this conversation of reproductive justice that really stands out for me is sexual health education for teenage, particularly boys and girls, for teenage, kids. And I know for me, again, my history, reversed 30 years ago and a low income, biracial Black woman living in Detroit, zero sex education, was clueless. I didn't even know how to track my menstrual cycle, right? Like just absolutely completely ignorant on purpose. Like that was, by design. We didn't get it in school, or the little bit that we got was uncomfortable and embarrassing. Mom, working single mom, she didn't have time. It's just kind of you could throw out to the wolves and sink or swim, figure it out for yourself. And sure enough, I end up pregnant and in need of an abortion. And, this was before you could have the pill type. So medical abortions, which were terrifying, terrifying, terrifying experiences. But then it was just a cycle because, have the abortion and then my option is the pill. Well, then the pill makes me sick and then. So having access to sexual health information that also doesn't necessarily conform to the status quo. So for me, what I evolved into is studying herbalism and learning about herbal methods of birth control and learning about fertility management and tracking my cycle and these things that are that were at the time outside of the norm of conventional birth control because at that time they weren't even really pushing IUDs. It was mostly the pills, right? So being able to step outside of that and educate myself about different ways that I could manage my fertility and not have, a non-consensual pregnancy, that changed my whole life, right? That was empowerment for me. So I think that conversation of sex education starting for teenagers when you're able to reproduce, that's when you should be getting this information, if not sooner, and having comprehensive, that's the word I'm looking for, comprehensive pleasure based and then realistic sex education, like here are some options but here are some other options, like inclusive sex education, I would say. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Oh,
Sorry, go on, Elena.
I was just going to add to that, Davy. That's a point that really stands out for me as well. The kind of the paradox of rallying against abortions while also suppressing sex education and access to contraception and healthcare and resources that like truly if your hope is to reduce abortions, it seems like the fastest route to that would actually be providing people with resources rather than you know, punishing them through laws.
Well, shame about sexuality is one of the threads that goes through. And, I was looking at a lot of your podcasts and the degree to which it's important that you're shifting the frame
Mm.
to pleasure and to being able to appreciate this as an important dimension of living. And in terms of the repression of sex and sexuality. So most sex ed still is abstinence based.
Yes.
Mhm. Yeah.
As long as the focus is don't have sex and certainly don't have out of wedlock children.
Mhm.
And again, the not having children, sort of at the core of all of this is what kind of children should be had? Who's of value? Who's in the mix?
Mm-hmm.
What's the country going to look like? And then how are we going to use everybody else who we don't really want in the mix?
But
So we can
you,
enslave them, we can decimate them, we can make their lives miserable, we can starve them in order to build ballrooms. It's the connection to in general, even knowing about your sexuality
Yes.
It's
Yes.
as if we don't tell you, you won't figure it out.
Yeah.
I think it's such a strange understanding of how people are. Like, won't we explore? Won't I notice? That feels good. I'll just feel ashamed.
Well, exactly. And so that's that I call it a psychological chastity belt, right?
Oh,
So
that's
that's
nice.
the thing. We're so conditioned from the time we're children, from the time we're first caught by, an elder touching our genitals when we're toddlers, because all toddlers do it, and we're shamed about touching our own bodies. And that imprints in our body and it imprints in the nervous system and makes us, quite frankly, less curious. It makes us less inclined to explore. And then when we do want to explore, we're fed mainstream porn, which is also in many cases life alienating and dehumanizing and oppressive, right? And fulfills a specific narrative and agenda for many people. I'm talking about mainstream porn, not all porn. So it's a again, it's by design, but it's all these little, micro instances of um, being separated from our sexual selves. That begins in childhood. And then again, that ripples and replicates and perpetuates for the rest of our lives.
I would just add, though, that if you're trying to explain the illogic of banning abortion and birth control, and yet having a pronatalist, white supremacist ideology, the way that that shows up is if you look at the teen pregnancy rates around the country. And teen pregnancy has been declining, even with the bad abstinence programs and all of that, for every population of teenagers except one: highly religious, ill educated white teenagers.
Mm.
They're the ones where their teen pregnancy rates are going through the roof. And so there is an intentionality about teaching about shame, failing to give them education, but knowing that biology is biology. People are going to play around and find out anyway. And then you end up with the consequence of an increase in white teen pregnancies, which also leads to the commodification of white babies that are very valuable on the market. And so, if you use a lens to understand how white supremacist thinking operates, you can connect the dots
Mhm.
and make sense out of what looks like illogical touch points.
Yeah,
Because it's logical to think, well, if they don't want uh, abortions, why don't you provide effective sex education and birth control
right.
to prevent unplanned pregnancies? But it's a lot more complicated than that
Mhm.
linear line.
Because there's an overarching agenda, and that agenda is the upliftment and continuation of a white supremacist social structure.
Exactly.
But also an ill educated one.
Yeah,
Don't forget the lack of education,
thank you.
because what they don't necessarily want is a highly educated, burgeoning white population, which of course is again attached to the attack on colleges and universities and thinking and all this other stuff,
Hmm.
because that also would threaten them.
Hmm.
It used to be that your views on sexuality and abortion correlated very highly with your education. That if you had college education of any kind, if you went to a Catholic institution, a Lutheran institution, that your views would be more liberal. Now, I haven't checked this out lately, but it is a sort of it makes sense, right? In a way that these are institutions that, despite perhaps their best efforts, do encourage thinking
Hmm.
and asking
Hmm.
and questioning. So um, I think it's critical. And the other piece in what you're saying, Loretta, is, the racial lens. I mean, the racial lens always, in terms of who's who's getting pregnant, whose pregnancies we'll take care of, whose
Hmm.
pregnancies we won't even notice, so we don't even care if you're getting good health care or not.
Mhm.
And I wanted to say something about the midwifery thing that you had raised, Davy, a while ago. Um, that too is a historically old story in terms of the criminalization and the negative
Yes.
images of Black women who were midwives. The granny midwives they took care of everybody, not
Right.
just Black people. But to sort of have people believe that midwives were dirty, that they weren't up to the technology, that they didn't know what they were doing, is really embedded in
Mhm.
this story.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
for the reason that you said, which is that using a midwife improves birth outcomes
Mhm.
for
Yeah,
people of color. It just does.
exactly. Exactly.
Today, as it did in the 19th century.
Well, and then the whole thing of criminalizing midwifery is exactly an example of white male patriarchy.
Exactly.
Like it's like, oh,
Exactly.
A, they're women, and B, they're black. I mean, what the heck can they
What
know?
could be
Right?
worse? Right?
They're
Yes.
inferior. They're
Yeah.
absolutely they're inferior humans, and our superior knowledge that came from experimenting on these black women, that's much more superior, knowledge than whatever, whatever lives in their bones, so to speak. So yeah, I mean, the whole history of that dynamic is an example of the dominance of white male patriarchy.
But I also want to pick up another echo that you had, Debbie, because you were talking about increasing your knowledge of herbs and contraception and womb wellness and stuff like that. But if you go back to Black history, you can find documentation that there were whole plantations of Black women who refused to have babies in slavery.
Yep.
And that
Yep.
was because they had brought over with them knowledge from
Yes.
Africa,
Yep.
where they were practicing effective contraception and using abortifacients.
Yep.
And the reason we know about that is the fragments of documentation that white doctors
Yep.
committed to when they were asked to investigate why, despite all of the sexual abuse and stuff going on, whole plantations are not having babies. And
Yes.
it was because of those midwives and those women who had what one doctor called secrets about gestation
Yep.
that we don't know about.
Yep.
So you're also tapping into very ancient wisdom
Yes,
that
very much.
because those enslaved women weren't able to write it down, that doesn't mean it didn't exist.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
these stories that we can uncover, I think they're inspiring for people. They're energizing. Like look, even under the most oppressive conditions, people found ways to resist.
Hmm.
And right now, finding those sources of hope is really important.
Hmm. Hmm. And so, where do you suggest we seek for those sources of hope? I know your book is one of them, your new book. Also, I'm
Read the
also,
book.
yes, definitely read this book. And I'm going to say, like, for me, as I said, it's phenomenal, fantastic, and I must titrate it because of what it stimulates inside of me,
Yeah,
because of what lives inside of me.
right.
And Loretta, I'm also reading your book, Calling In, which is it's a necessary concept of building bridges and finding points of union with all these different, political and lived ideologies. And I had an experience of that this weekend. I had wanted to share of I was at a little event, and it was a little painting party with some of our neighbors, and one of the women and I, a white woman and I, started talking, and we had some good rapport. And then she started talking about politics, and she's very much a Trump supporter, and I'm like, fine, but I didn't want to like be a party pooper. So I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And I said, well, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? And she said, I think it's really bad. It's really bad when government, because she was talking about the Democrats. I think it's really bad when government, makes people suffer. And I'm like, that we agree on. And I personally believe that none of the parties are.
We lost your audio, Davy.
Sorry, I tapped it. Can you hear me?
Right at none of the parties.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
we lost you at none of the parties.
apologize. I personally believe that none of the parties are effectively supporting our well-being as human beings, and that they're not, none of them are working in our best interest. And she agreed. And so even though we're on these quote unquote opposite sides of the political spectrum, though I don't consider myself a Democrat, I am 100% an anarchist. Um, we're on opposite sides of the political spectrum, we could agree on the fact that we believe that the purpose of government was to support the well-being of the people, and that it was failing miserably. So we agreed on that. So that came, I wanted to share with you, Loretta. That was a real life experience from listening to your book, and the awarenesses that it stimulated inside of me, and then I was able to carry that into my next interaction. So thank you for that.
Well, we have shared suffering, but we don't have common solutions. And
Mhm.
that's where we have to use, I think, calling in techniques so that we can share those solutions to our suffering and stop succumbing to blaming each other. Because
Yes.
the divide and conquer is very, very real. And so I tend to believe that my job is to focus on the puppeteers, not the puppets.
Yes,
You
thank
know,
you.
I call out the puppeteers, the ones manipulating the pain
Yes.
of the MAGA people, the Trump people. But I tend to give, a listen and sometimes the benefit of the doubt to the
Mm-hmm.
puppets whose pain is being manipulated because their
Exactly.
pain is real. It's just that the solutions they're being offered are all false.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. Thank you for that. Beautiful, beautiful
And
point.
also, it was as you stuck with it, Davy,
Hmm.
you were able to go deep, like go beyond but this is where we disagree. But
Hmm.
underneath that
Hmm.
is a value that
Yes.
we agree on, that we share.
Shared value. Yep. Yep.
And I think that that's the not being able to have the conversation preempts getting there.
Yes,
Mhm.
exactly.
It's
Exactly.
so
And the reaction, right?
yes,
Because I could have in that moment just been like closed the door and written her off,
exactly.
right? But
Exactly.
instead, and partially because we were there in person and we had already established just a little bit of a human connection. Like, oh
Exactly.
yeah, you're from Michigan, I'm from Michigan, so we are just like vibing on each other. And then when the politics came out, because we had already had a human connection established, I wanted to maintain that connection, right? I didn't want to destroy that connection or pollute that connection, right? And so it's that speaks to how being in person with each other really can help dissolve those barriers, because online it's easy to scream at each other. Online it's easy to vomit out rage at each other because there is no human connection. And I believe that online world really, again, manipulates that and really promotes that type of toxic dispute. Whereas being in person with each other, we feel each other's humanity. Or at least there's the potential to feel and experience each other's humanity. So it makes it easier to want to preserve that than it does online. That's been my experience.
Well, I like us finding our common love languages with each other.
Yeah.
Because, like, as a Southerner, my love language is grits. I can talk grits to anybody who grew up on them, whether they're sweet, whether they're salty, whether they're buttered, whether they're soupy. And you establish that human to human connection. Up here in the Northeast, it might be lobster rolls,
Yep.
you know, maybe out in the Midwest, and whether you call it soda or pop, I don't
Yep.
know. Find that common human love language and start from there, and you'll be awed
Yeah.
by how you can make human to human connections despite the superficial divisions
Yeah.
of politics and race and identity and stuff. Because underneath it, we're all human beings in search of love, in search of peace, in search of joy,
Yes.
in search of fulfillment.
Yes. Yes.
I
And
will say it's not that easy. I mean, because
yes.
everything's weaponized.
Yes.
Even what kind of food you eat, and what kind of, that it's all in the service of keeping these divisions going. So, um, I look for inspiration to wherever the resistance is, wherever I see it, and there's a lot of it now. It's and you have to swallow a lot. You can't be putting too fine a point on, well, that isn't exactly the kind of resistance I wanted to see. Just affirm it
Mhm.
and see it for what it is.
But I
Affirming our
think part
humanity.
of the problem is what is people's motivations for resistance.
Yes.
Because if they do it from a place of anger and bitterness,
Yes.
then they're going to become just as oppressive as what they're fighting.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know,
Ooh, yes.
if you
Yep.
don't do it from a place of joy, love, and peace, you're going to go about doing the right thing the wrong way.
Ooh, beautiful. And we just hosted an event called Pleasure is Resistance, talking about
Yeah,
how,
that it is.
yeah, pleasure is a resource filling us up, again, cellularly, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. So
That's
focusing on
great.
pleasure to fill our cup so that we can, that is our resistance there, but then also being full to enact resistance in the world, so to speak.
Exactly. I
Yeah.
love that.
So yeah, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Wow. Well, it's an honor and a privilege to sit with you both, and share our humanity together. Elena, is there anything else that you want to contribute or interject into the conversation?
I just want to say thank you so much for being here. Yeah, it's been an absolute joy. And Loretta, yeah, that your last words really resonated with me of keeping hope and joy and connection present as the root of activism. So thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for this. Back at you and all of it. It's been a great, rich, and in many different ways conversation. We've followed those tentacles.
Yes. Follow those threads to weave a tapestry.
Exactly.
Yay, wonderful. Well, you can get their book, Abortion and Reproductive Justice, An Essential Guide to Resistance. Where can folks buy your book? Find your book online? Amazon, I'm guessing?
Yeah, but for those who don't or trying not to,
Amazon.
you can go to the University of California Press and do it, or any of your independent bookstore, your local if you have one independent bookstore. It's good to you can buy the book and support that.
Beautiful. And you can go to Loretta's website at lorettajross.com. And you can also find Loretta J. Ross on Instagram. I found you on Instagram the other day and started to follow you. So I'll be giving you shouts out.
She's much better at the social media than I am, but
Well,
she's
we
younger.
bring a combined, I mean, think about it, Marlene. We've got over 100 years of social justice activism together.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
our love task is to share it with others. So, like they say, instead of making old mistakes, let's learn how to make new ones.
Yeah, right.
Beautiful. 100 years of social justice activism. Wow. Wow. Again, what a privilege and what a gift and what an honor. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
being with us today. Thank you so much, audience, for listening to us. And we do hope that if you found this conversation enriching and juicy, that you head on over to lorettajross.com and buy that amazing book. Also, hit up Loretta J. Ross on Instagram and make sure that you drop us a comment if your heart was as filled as ours was from this conversation. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. And we'll see you next week for another episode of Sex is Medicine.
You've been listening to Sex is Medicine, your #1 resource for holistic sex education.
Make sure you like and subscribe to Sex is Medicine on all your listening platforms and follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, where you can get your daily dose of Sex is Medicine videos and episode recaps. Also, make sure you register for your weekly dose of Sex is Medicine at holisticsexologyinstitute.com and send us your questions, please, at questions@holisticsexologyinstitute.com. Thank you so much for listening to Sex is Medicine.